Now let's leverage our data sources window, which we've now set up with 3 data sets. This is our create item form, so we need to use a data set that allows us to do additions and updates to our database. As you remember, that would be the DS items dataset. The DS inventory dataset allowed us to view read-only data from multiple tables, whereas the item grouping provided us with a method to do an insert into this link table to associate items to groups. If you expand DS items, you'll notice that there's an item icon. By default, if I dragged over the item itself onto my form, it would automatically create a control called the data grid view. The data grid view allows me to view rows in my table in a tabular format. In this case, we want to work with items one by one, so we're going to select a details view. A details view shows me a form-like interface to work with my data, one record at a time. Associating controls to pieces of data also applies for the different columns that I have available. By default, this icon with the AB and the line indicates that it's a text box. Because the item ID is a primary key and it's auto-generated, we'll want to choose something that's read-only, so we can choose a label icon. The name and description can remain as text fields. If you look at the drop-down list that's available, Visual Studio is intelligent enough to understand what kind of data type that you're working with. For any date-time data type, it automatically allows us to select from a date-time picker. However, if we take a look at description, we don't see date-time picker. This is because it's not a date-time field. For item category ID, this ID references a lookup table in our category table. Therefore, if the data is coming back from a category table, it makes sense for us to go ahead and use this as a drop-down list to populate directly from that table. That way, we reduce the chances of errors from our users by accidentally typing in a category ID that may not have a match in the lookup table. So we can change this to be a combo box, which will allow us to pick from a list of pre-selected items. Later, we'll configure this combo box to pull from the category table. So now, we have 2 choices here. We could just drag over our individual controls one by one and drag them onto our design surface, or we can take the whole group in its entirety, the whole details view, and drag that onto our form. Let's go ahead and do this and drag it onto the right panel. Many things happen once you do this. If you notice in your component tray, let's maximize our real estate to see the component tray, we have a variety of different objects that are added. One is an actual reference to our data set, the DS items data set. By clicking on this, you can see that it's a data set of DS items using the schema that's provided for us in the XSD file. You also notice an item binding source. This provides a mechanism for a DVD-like interface to allow you to navigate through all the rows in your data set. It does this using an item binding navigator control, which is the tool strip that you see at the top of your form. It can navigate to the very first record. It can navigate back and forward. It has controls for indicating how many records that you're iterating through, as well as the ability to add, delete, save any data items. Should we have used a DS inventory data set, because it's read-only, we wouldn't see these add, delete, and save options. We'd only have controls that were analogous to a read-only state. We also notice that we have an item table adapter. If you look in the Properties window, you can see we can also edit the queries in the Data Designer, the same window we worked with earlier, as well as add queries or preview the data that's available. If you select the Preview Data option, this brings up the same screen, the Preview screen, that we can also use from the Data Designer. And if we click on the Preview button, we can see all the data elements that we have available in our table adapter. We also have a Table Adapter Manager that allows us to manage our table adapters. Let's save all our changes. If we take a look at some of the items that we have in our component tray, such as the binding source, we can manipulate the properties that are available inside the Properties window. One of the most powerful things that a binding source has is the ability to filter the data. So once you bring back the data from the data set, you can actually filter using a specific clause, as you would very much like a where clause. You can also use your binding source to sort data. The binding source also fires notifications. If you click on the lightning bolt for events, you can see all the notifications that are fired. For example, binding is complete, or an error has occurred, or if the underlying data source has changed. Let's clean up our form a little bit. For the item ID label control, let's go to the Properties window, select the Properties icon, and then in the text property, just go ahead and delete where it says Label 1. This will automatically be populated with a primary key. Now let's set up our item category drop-down list. Select the item category drop-down, and let's configure multiple data bindings for this control. Data-bound controls work for both web application and desktop applications. It allows you to set a specific data source to pull data for your particular control. By default, our objects on our form are bound to our DS items data set. And as we indicated earlier, Visual Studio is smart enough to select the appropriate control that's right for that particular object. So for category ID, we want to configure the data source to be our category table. In the Properties window, for data source, you can choose from a variety of data sources that are available. We have 3 project data sources, inventory, item grouping, and DS items, but right now we don't have one for category. We can also add a project data source right from this window. Select the Add Project Data Source. By now you should be familiar with this window. Click through using the inventory string, and then for the table, select Category, change a dataset name to be DS Category. Select Finish. Now our data source is bound to the category binding data source in our data source collection window. The next thing we'll need to do is change the display member. This is the value that's displayed in the actual dropdown itself for the user to choose from. To make it easier on the user, let's use name instead of category ID. Name makes much more sense for a user to pick from. However, behind the scenes, we want to store category ID in our item table. In order to set that, sort alphabetically, scroll to the bottom, and choose Value Member. For Value Member, let's select Category ID. So the value that the user selects will be the ID, but the display that the user sees will be the name. The last thing we need to do is bind this data to our item table. Although we're getting the data to populate the dropdown from the Categories table, we ultimately want our combo box to be bound to the item table. We can set that by scrolling to the top and exploring the data binding source. Let's go ahead and set the selected value to the item binding source and select Item Category ID. For the text, let's go ahead and delete this property. We already have a display member and a value member already set. And that's it. That's all we have to do to leverage data from one table to populate a control and have the data stored in yet another table. Save all our changes. Let's run the application by pressing F5. Select the Create Item button. As you can see, we have 9 records. Our control automatically pulls the data from our table and allows us to navigate through the data that we have available. The item category ID is populating directly from the item table. The drop-down list is populating from the category table. We can navigate through the records, or we can go to the very end of a record. Let's close this application and close the main form. Hit Stop to stop execution. We have one more piece of functionality we'd like to add. Let's add logic for adding new items. Select the Add button from the navigation pane. In the events, double-click on the click event. Inside here, let's first add a try block. Type in EX for the exception variable. And then inside the try, let's add some logic to manipulate the item binding source. The first thing we'd like to do when the add new item is occurring is to toggle us out of edit mode. We can do that by calling the item binding source .endEdit method. Next, we can leverage the update method that was automatically created for us in our item table adapter. Type in item table adapter and select update. By default, we have 6 overloaded instances for the update method. Some of these accept data rows, while others accept data tables and data sets. or you can pass in the individual items one by one. We'll pass in our data set to make things simple. Type in dsItems.item. This will allow us to add our items successfully to our data set. We'll later build upon this form to allow us to associate groups to the item. We certainly don't want to create orphan records in our database, as all items need to belong to a group. Let's pause there, save all our changes, and close all the documents. We'll continue to add functionality to our system in future chapters.